intersections with your own work? Do you have ways in which you thought, oh, that's so interesting, because I've also been thinking about, if you have any of those thoughts that you had of overlapping places, could you share with us?
That's my mom, so that's no way I'm going to answer that first. So.
I was really like pleasantly surprised to find sort of how like our approach to a lot of like institutional practices in our field and how we are trying to examine it is incredibly sort of like similar. So I was really surprised to see that. And yeah, I think for me, besides like the content in their presentation where they draw inspiration from, like some of the sources like they were sort of talking about, like I'm extremely interested in reading more about. So yeah, that was one of the main things.
Yeah, I think there's kind of definite overlaps. I think when I heard Adam's presentation back in February when we were practicing these, I realized we were kind of thinking about similar things. And I think without, you know, despite being in this program for so long, I hadn't really realized that kind of there was a definite like overlap in terms of having studied cultural studies and some sort of design discipline. And I think we were both kind of wrestling with like, how do you deal with these disciplines that have these really complicated pasts and still be kind of an active designer or whatever in the present. And I think, yeah.
I'd also agree. I saw a lot of overlaps, but I think it's interesting how all of us are kind of talking about very similar things, but with very different words, you know, and a lot of that comes from kind of the disciplines we're coming from, especially at RISD. I feel like I was thinking the whole time about Eliza's point yesterday about like audiences and the scales of our audiences, like coming from craft majors. I feel like Yinan and I are thinking about almost like it's taboo to talk about the user, whereas like I feel like a lot of interior architecture is all about publics and stuff. It's just a word we don't use, but I think you can do really exciting things with that word. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listening to all of you over the last couple of days, and I've been really struck by how articulate you are, and I'm kind of curious how it feels to be an extremely articulate student and intellectual and theory-based at RISD, and then being kind of an artist at Brown. I mean, what does it feel like a dichotomy over the last 5 years, or how does that affect it?
I think, I mean, I feel like the gut reaction is always, yes, it's jolting, but I feel like, especially like freshman and sophomore year, I'm realizing now I had a really nasty sort of internalized superiority complex at RISD about, look at all these people I can cite, look at all these names I can drop, and I feel like that really belittles the fact that embodied knowledge and things that you learn through making are on the same playing field absolutely all the time. And I think it seems like a cliche to say that, maybe especially at art school, but taking that strongly and realizing that there's one way to talk about things, which is citation, and there's another way to talk about things, which is joinery. And those can talk to each other, and they're always in conversation.
Yeah. I'd say I'd also been kind of pleasantly surprised in that it might also just be kind of specific to my majors, but I encountered kind of a lot of artists in American studies who each kind of, maybe not kind of visual artists, but people doing music or literature. And also at RISD, we have kind of this, research at RISD, I think, is a complex thing. In one way, it manifests in interior architecture is kind of like the first few weeks of the studio is looking at kind of the existing context of a site. And I think in my first few projects, I felt kind of out of place. I remember like being called like history boy at one point. But like in my most recent project where, and I mean, in all of them, they've been relatively collaborative research processes. It was really interesting to see kind of like other students getting really interested in kind of the history of Providence and finding their own sources and like bringing things in. And I think maybe it was important that I was there and to like kickstart that, but I think also like a lot of that was happening already.
Yeah, I think perhaps most of us dual degree students don't particularly fit in the sort of conformative expectations of student that belongs to a certain school. But I really think in terms of like practicing, trying to do work, I think all of these other characteristic is something you bring, but not necessarily like your approach to do work. I think anything that people spend a significant time and energy on, like across the disciplines, either being science or art or the humanities, they've spent an incredible amount like examining, being very critical, very analytical, and I really see this sort of practices at both institutions.
Good. I have a question. All three of you seem to have sort of a fraught or maybe quizzical relationship to the artifact. And I'm wondering now, looking back on the way you've brought together both sides of your education, if you might want to talk about how you feel about artifacts.
Well, I think I feel more strongly about the practice of collecting behind and how artifact is presented and who's in a position to collect, because I believe that through the act of collecting in institutions such as museums, like certain people's history are actively being ignored. I was really interested in like this concept of, why, let's use an example from my discipline, why the jewelries we see in the museums are always those of like the nobility across culturally. Then that makes me start to think then I really never knew what people were like besides those who had the power and the position to preserve their things. So I guess, yeah, I feel stronger about the practice of collecting rather than like the concept of artifact itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think artifacts have been something that have been interesting to me. Also, just American Studies is partly based in the public humanities at Brown, which part of its roots are in kind of what would be called like museum studies. And when I haven't been working in architecture, I've been working in museums. And I think it's been interesting to think about kind of, my like RISD side has been devoted to architecture, kind of how like artifacts of different scales, kind of what preservation looks like on different levels, working in like a textile collection, kind of the material needs of textile make preservation totally different than, a building in which modern addition can be added to it, and that's, considered a form of preservation. And so I think, being able to work across different levels of artifacts is also kind of given like a helpful space to think about like different ways of preservation.
Yeah, I mean, artifacts. I had like twin terrors throughout working on this. The first of being too tender to some of the infrastructure I was working with, and the other of not being tender enough with its ghosts. Those were two things that I really worried about the whole time, and I still feel uneasy about it. All the perpetually re-editing the way I phrase things and the way what kind of complicities I'm carrying with me in the way I talk. I think two important things that have helped me with that, just as a person, are one, not having all your theoretical eggs in your same basket. So like a big chunk I cut from my presentation was my work as a operator at the CNC machine, working on other people's projects, and I think running as fast as you can away from that male designer ego and realizing that you haven't thought anything that hasn't been thought in some shape or form before, I think is really important. And the second being, just just putting your money where your mouth is in terms of, especially if you're doing theory or things that use theory, you always have to think about the shape of the room you're in and who's in the room with you and how that might change or how that could be thought otherwise. Yeah.
Great. Anyone else? Do you have a question you want to ask each other?
I think you guys are cool.